He believed the greatest threat to his empire would arrive wearing an expensive suit, carrying polished credentials, and speaking flawless diplomacy. But the person who would save everything stood quietly beside a silver coffee cart, dressed in a plain black maid's uniform, hoping no one would notice her. The rain had washed Manhattan into a mirror of blurred lights as the black SUVs rolled through the iron gates of the Moretti estate, where power was measured not by loud voices, but by silent decisions worth millions of dollars. Inside the mansion, crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors while executives, translators, attorneys, and foreign investors filled the grand conference hall with conversations spoken in English, Italian, French, Japanese, and Arabic. Every seat had been assigned weeks in advance because today's negotiations would determine the future of Vincent Moretti's international shipping network, a business that reached ports across 3 continents and employed thousands of people. Claire Bennett kept her eyes lowered as she arranged porcelain cups onto a polished walnut serving cart. She had worked in the mansion for just over 8 months, long enough to learn one rule above every other. Invisible people survived. Invisible people kept their jobs. Invisible people were never remembered after meetings ended. That was exactly how Claire wanted it. She moved silently between marble columns, replacing coffee, refilling water glasses, straightening napkins that no one else noticed. Around her, expensive watches flashed beneath tailored sleeves while educated men discussed contracts thicker than law textbooks. None of them spared a second glance toward the quiet young maid with her hair neatly tied back and her calm expression fixed somewhere between professionalism and caution. Vincent Moretti entered without announcement. He never needed one. Conversations simply stopped. At 38, he carried himself with the effortless confidence of someone accustomed to making impossible decisions before breakfast. His charcoal suit fit with precise elegance, yet nothing about him demanded attention more than his composure. His dark eyes swept across the room only once before everyone instinctively stood. Not because they feared shouting, because he never raised his voice. "Let's begin," he said. The negotiations unfolded with mechanical precision as presentations shifted from English to Italian, then to French. Professional interpreters translated every sentence while legal advisors compared contracts projected across enormous digital screens. Claire continued serving coffee without looking directly at anyone until a single sentence drifted across the room in flawless Japanese. She froze for less than a heartbeat. Something was wrong. The interpreter smiled confidently while repeating the executive's words into English, but Claire's fingers tightened around the silver coffee pot. That wasn't what the man had said. Not even close. A tiny difference in vocabulary had transformed a routine shipping guarantee into an irreversible ownership transfer. Around the table, no one noticed. Every executive nodded. Every attorney remained silent. Pens prepared to sign documents worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Claire lowered her eyes again. She was only a maid. Correcting anyone would almost certainly cost her job. Yet she remembered her father's quiet voice from years ago saying that silence becomes expensive when truth is standing in front of you. Her pulse echoed inside her ears as Vincent reached for the fountain pen waiting beside the contract. The room felt impossibly still. Outside, thunder rolled across the Manhattan skyline. Inside, one forgotten employee stared at a mistake that everyone else had missed, knowing the next 5 seconds would decide not only her future, but the future of every person sitting around that table. Claire's breathing slowed as she forced herself to think instead of panic. Every instinct told her to step back, lower her head, and disappear into the background exactly as she had done every day since arriving at the Moretti estate. But the Japanese executive had not spoken about transferring permanent ownership of the shipping routes. He had proposed a temporary operating partnership with equal legal protections for both companies. One careless translation had completely reversed the balance of the agreement. If Vincent signed the document now, he would voluntarily surrender authority over ports his family had spent decades building. She watched the interpreter smile with professional confidence, while several attorneys quietly highlighted paragraphs on their tablets, trusting every translated word without question. Claire felt the weight of the silver coffee pot growing heavier in her hands. Her father had once told her that language was never simply vocabulary. Language carried intention, culture, history, and consequences. One misplaced word could end a friendship, destroy a business, or start a war of misunderstandings. She swallowed hard as Vincent uncapped his fountain pen. The polished black barrel hovered above the signature line. Another second passed, then another. Finally, before fear could silence her forever, Claire spoke in a voice so soft that she almost didn't recognize it herself. "Excuse me, Mr. Moretti." Every head turned toward her. The room fell silent with astonishing speed. One of the senior attorneys frowned as though someone had interrupted a sacred ceremony. The chief operations officer stared at her in disbelief. The head interpreter looked openly irritated. Vincent slowly lifted his eyes from the contract. His expression revealed nothing. Claire immediately wished she could take the words back. Her heartbeat pounded against her ribs, but she forced herself to continue. "The translation isn't accurate." No one moved. The interpreter let out a short laugh that carried more confidence than kindness. "I believe the staff has confused similar terminology." A few executives exchanged amused glances. Someone near the end of the table whispered, "She's the maid." Another quietly chuckled. Claire felt heat rise into her face, yet she kept her attention on the contract instead of the people watching her. Vincent rested the pen beside the document without saying a word. "Explain," he said calmly. Claire inhaled once before speaking directly to the Japanese delegation in fluent Japanese. The visiting chairman blinked with visible surprise before answering her immediately. Their conversation continued. For nearly 30 seconds, smooth, respectful, and completely effortless. Several guests stared as though they had forgotten she was wearing a housekeeping uniform. When the exchange ended, Claire turned toward Vincent. He confirmed they are proposing a renewable operating partnership with shared oversight. The interpreter translated ownership instead of operational authority. Those are completely different legal concepts. Before anyone could respond, she shifted toward the French legal advisor and repeated the relevant clause in perfect French, pointing to a sentence buried deep inside the contract. The attorney's confident smile disappeared. Claire then addressed an Italian consultant, clarifying an overlooked financial condition in flawless Italian before politely asking an Arabic investor one brief question in Arabic to verify another paragraph referenced during the meeting. Finally, she summarized everything in precise English. No dramatic gestures, no arrogance, only quiet certainty. The silence that followed felt heavier than the rain outside. The interpreter's face had turned pale. Several attorneys hurriedly reread the documents while comparing them against the original multilingual versions. Vincent remained perfectly still, studying Claire with an expression no one in the room could interpret. For the first time since the meeting had begun, the most powerful people around the table were no longer looking at contracts. They were looking at the maid they had never truly seen before. The chairman from Osaka slowly closed his leather portfolio and looked directly at Vincent before speaking in measured English. "Your employee translated our proposal correctly." The words landed with quiet force, stripping every confident expression from the advisors surrounding the table. A senior attorney immediately requested the original Japanese draft, while another reached for the certified bilingual copy. Pages turned rapidly. Tablets lit up across the polished walnut table. The atmosphere that had felt polished only moments earlier now carried the uncomfortable tension of professionals discovering they might have overlooked something fundamental. Claire remained exactly where she stood beside the coffee cart, wishing she could disappear behind the marble columns again. She had never wanted attention. She had only wanted the contract to reflect the truth. The chief interpreter adjusted his expensive glasses and forced a composed smile. There are always subtle variations in international business terminology. His voice remained calm, but tiny beads of perspiration had begun forming near his temples. Claire answered softly without challenging him. "Not in this sentence. The verb specifies delegated operational authority for a limited period. Permanent ownership would require entirely different legal construction." Before anyone could object, the Japanese chairman nodded with visible approval. "Exactly." A quiet murmur spread through the room. One executive who had laughed at Claire less than 2 minutes earlier suddenly avoided looking in her direction altogether. Another attorney began highlighting passages so quickly that his stylus nearly slipped from his hand. Vincent had not spoken once. He simply watched people reveal themselves. Years of leading complex negotiations had taught him That pressure exposed character far better than questions ever could. Some people admitted mistakes. Others searched for excuses. Others looked for someone weaker to blame. He had seen every version before. The chief operations officer finally broke the silence. Mr. Moretti, perhaps we should postpone the signing until our translation team performs another review. Vincent leaned back slightly in his chair. I thought your review was already complete. No one answered. The room felt colder despite the warmth from the fireplace burning along the far wall. Rain continued tapping gently against floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Claire lowered her eyes again, believing the meeting would continue without her. Instead, Vincent asked a question that caught everyone off guard. Miss Bennett, how many languages do you speak? She hesitated. 5 fluently, sir. Another pause settled over the conference room. Vincent's gaze never shifted. Which 5? English, Japanese, Italian, French, and Arabic, sir. Several. Guests stared at her with open disbelief. One investor quietly whispered something to his colleague, who responded with a slow shake of his head as though refusing to believe what he had just witnessed. Vincent rested both hands on the table. Where did you learn them? Claire answered honestly. My father taught comparative linguistics at Columbia before he passed away. My mother translated historical manuscripts. They believed every language deserved respect because every language carries a different way of seeing the world. The explanation was simple. There was no attempt to impress anyone. Yet somehow that sincerity unsettled the room more than any dramatic story could have. A senior legal consultant suddenly interrupted. If she possesses those qualifications, why is she working as a housekeeper? Claire remained silent for several seconds before answering. Life doesn't always continue according to the degrees hanging on a wall. No bitterness entered her voice. No embarrassment either. Only quiet acceptance. Vincent noticed something he had not expected. She never defended herself. She never criticized the people who had mocked her minutes earlier. She simply answered each question with the same calm honesty she had shown while correcting a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Around the table, the advisors resumed reviewing every translated page with new urgency. None of them realized that Vincent was no longer studying the documents. He was studying the people who had signed off on them without truly reading them, and the quiet maid who had cared enough to risk everything simply because the truth mattered more than protecting herself. Vincent closed the contract without signing a single page. The quiet click of the leather binder echoed across the conference room louder than any raised voice could have. Every executive instinctively understood that the meeting had changed course. It was no longer about an international partnership. It had become an examination of competence, judgment, and trust. Vincent rose from his chair and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-soaked skyline. His reflection blended with the lights of Manhattan while no one dared interrupt his thoughts. Behind him, attorneys continued comparing translations line by line, their earlier confidence replaced with careful hesitation. Claire remained beside the serving cart, her hands folded neatly in front of her, wondering whether she had just saved the company or guaranteed her own dismissal. She knew enough about powerful organizations to understand that exposing mistakes rarely earned gratitude. More often, it embarrassed the people responsible, and embarrassed people often searched for someone weaker to blame. Nearly 2 minutes passed before Vincent spoke again. Mr. Ellis. The head of legal immediately straightened in his chair. Yes, sir. Who approved today's multilingual review? Ellis hesitated only briefly. Our translation department completed the verification yesterday afternoon, and I authorized the final package after receiving their certification. Vincent nodded once. And how many people signed off before this reached my desk? Ellis glanced toward the stack of documents as though hoping the answer might somehow change. 7, including myself. Vincent said nothing. Silence had always been his preferred method of uncovering the truth. Under that silence, people usually revealed far more than they intended. The chief interpreter finally leaned forward. Mr. Moretti, with respect, translation is sometimes subjective. Minor variations happen in every international negotiation. Claire instinctively lowered her eyes again, wishing the conversation would end. Instead, Vincent turned toward the Japanese chairman. Would you consider this a minor variation? The chairman answered without hesitation. Absolutely not. Had we signed the English version instead of our original proposal, Both companies would have spent years disputing obligations neither side intended to create. We would have assumed your legal team rewrote the agreement without informing us. Another uncomfortable silence settled across the room. Several executives slowly exchanged anxious glances. One consultant quietly removed his reading glasses and rubbed his forehead. The polished confidence that had filled the conference room earlier that morning had completely disappeared. Vincent walked back toward the table with measured steps before stopping beside Claire. She kept her attention on the marble floor, expecting criticism rather than conversation. "Look at me, Miss Bennett." She raised her eyes carefully. There was no anger in his expression, only curiosity sharpened by experience. "When did you notice the error?" The first sentence translated from Japanese, "Sir. Why didn't you speak immediately?" Claire answered honestly. "Because I wasn't invited into the meeting. I thought I might have misunderstood. I checked every following paragraph in my head before I interrupted." Vincent considered her answer for several quiet seconds. "So you verified your own conclusion before correcting anyone?" "Yes, sir." One of the senior advisors could no longer remain silent. "Mr. Moretti, with all due respect, she's intelligent, but she's still an employee without legal authority. We cannot allow household staff to interrupt executive negotiations whenever they believe something sounds incorrect." Several people nodded cautiously, relieved that someone had finally voiced what they had been thinking. Claire's stomach tightened. She had expected this. Position mattered more than truth in many rooms like this. Vincent slowly shifted his attention toward the advisor. His expression remained perfectly calm, yet the atmosphere seemed to grow noticeably heavier. "Interesting," he said quietly. "So your concern isn't that she was wrong." He paused just long enough for every person around the table to feel the weight of the unfinished sentence. "Your concern is that she was right." No one answered. Outside, the rain continued falling against the glass while inside the conference room every carefully constructed hierarchy had begun to crack, not because a maid had spoken beyond her station, but because competence had appeared where arrogance had never thought to look. The conference room remained silent long after Vincent's words settled over the polished table. No one challenged him. No one defended the hierarchy they had relied upon only minutes before. Outside, the storm drifted across the Manhattan skyline, its steady rhythm against the glass becoming the only sound in the room. Vincent slowly returned to his chair, but did not reopen the contract. Instead, he folded his hands and looked toward the legal team with the same measured composure that had earned him a reputation for making decisions no one saw coming. "We will take a 30-minute recess," he said. "No documents leave this room. No one contacts anyone outside this meeting." His voice never rose above a calm conversation, yet every executive immediately nodded. Chairs slid backward across the marble floor as the guests quietly stepped into smaller groups, whispering in lowered voices. Some compared translations again, while others avoided speaking altogether. Claire remained standing beside the coffee cart, uncertain whether she should leave or wait for instructions. Before she could decide, Vincent looked directly at her. "Miss Bennett." She straightened immediately. "Yes, sir. Come with me." Every pair of eyes followed them as Vincent walked through the carved oak doors leading toward his private study. Claire followed several steps behind, careful to keep her distance. The hallway felt unusually quiet compared to the tension they had left behind. Family portraits lined the walls beside antique clocks that ticked with perfect precision, each second making Claire more certain that she was about to lose the job she depended upon. When Vincent entered the study, he closed the door gently behind them. The room reflected disciplined elegance rather than extravagance. Shelves filled with history, economics, philosophy, and international law covered one wall, while rain filtered soft gray light through tall windows overlooking the gardens. Vincent walked toward his desk, but remained standing instead of sitting. He studied Claire for several long moments before speaking. "How many universities accepted you?" The unexpected question caught her completely off guard. She blinked once. "3, sir." "Which one did you attend?" "Columbia." Vincent nodded almost imperceptibly. "Languages?" "Comparative linguistics and international communication." Another brief silence followed. Claire wondered how he had reached those conclusions so quickly. Then she remembered she had mentioned her parents only minutes earlier. Vincent noticed the realization in her expression. "Your vocabulary changes when you discuss language," he said calmly. People reveal their education more often than they realize. Claire lowered her eyes. I never intended to hide it, sir. Then why are you serving coffee instead of negotiating contracts? She hesitated. The answer carried memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. My parents passed away within 8 months of each other. Medical expenses consumed everything they had saved. I left graduate school to care for my younger brother until he finished college. After that, she stopped, searching for words that would not sound like excuses. Life became about paying bills instead of rebuilding dreams. Vincent listened without interrupting. There was no sympathy in his expression, but there was attention. Something Claire had learned was often more meaningful. Where is your brother now? Seattle, sir. He's an elementary school teacher. A faint smile touched her face for the first time that day. He loves what he does. Vincent noticed that the smile disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. She never spoke about sacrifice as though it made her exceptional. She simply described it as another fact of life. He walked to a cabinet and removed 5 documents written in different languages. Without explanation, he placed them across the desk. Translate the key legal differences. Claire looked at the papers, then back at him. Now, sir. Now. She nodded once, took a careful breath, and began reading. Vincent quietly stepped toward the window, watching neither the rain nor the city beyond it. Instead, he listened to the steady turning of pages behind him, already suspecting that the greatest mistake made inside his organization that morning had not been a mistranslated contract. It had been allowing someone with extraordinary ability to spend 8 months believing she was invisible. Claire reached for the first document with steady hands despite the uncertainty still lingering in her mind. The pages before her represented 5 separate legal agreements written in Japanese, Italian, French, Arabic, and English, each containing subtle differences that could easily escape someone reading too quickly. She began with the Japanese version, carefully tracing every clause the way her father had taught her years earlier, never translating individual words before understanding the intention behind the sentence. Vincent remained silent near the window, giving no indication whether this was an interview, an examination, or the final step before dismissal. 15 quiet minutes passed before Claire placed the final page back onto the desk. She organized the documents into a neat stack before looking toward him. There are 9 inconsistencies, sir. Vincent turned slowly. Only 9. Claire nodded. 9 legal inconsistencies. For stylistic differences that don't affect the agreement. 2 cultural adaptations intended to improve readability. Those are appropriate. The legal issues are not. Vincent walked back to the desk and sat opposite her for the first time that afternoon. Show me. Claire opened the Italian version first. This paragraph changes liability from shared responsibility to proportional responsibility. They sound similar, but in Italian commercial law they produce different obligations during shipping delays. She moved to the French document. Here, the deadline appears identical, but the phrase used allows extensions under exceptional circumstances. The English version removes that flexibility completely. Vincent listened without interrupting while Claire continued through each language, never rushing, never dramatizing her explanations. Every observation was supported by precise reasoning rather than confidence alone. When she finished, Vincent quietly compared her notes against the annotations prepared earlier by his legal department. Every discrepancy she identified matched concerns his attorneys had overlooked until after the conference began. He closed the folders and rested his hands together. Who else knows you can do this? Claire looked genuinely confused by the question. No one, sir. Not even the head housekeeper? She shook her head gently. Mrs. Alvarez hired me because she needed dependable staff. She asked whether I could clean, organize schedules, and maintain privacy. I answered yes. My education never became relevant. Vincent studied her expression carefully. There was no resentment, no frustration. She spoke as though life had simply taken an unexpected path, and she had accepted it without bitterness. Most people spent years convincing the world they deserved more than they had been given. Claire had spent years asking for nothing at all. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Vincent's executive assistant stepped inside. Sir, the delegation is ready whenever you are. Vincent nodded once. Tell them another 10 minutes. The assistant hesitated briefly before leaving the room. Vincent waited until the door closed before speaking again. Miss Bennett, answer one final question. Yes, sir. When you corrected my meeting today, were you trying to impress me? Claire looked almost startled by the suggestion. No, sir. Then why risk your job? She lowered her eyes for only a moment before answering with quiet honesty. Because if everyone stayed silent whenever they noticed the truth, mistakes would eventually become normal. The room grew still again. Vincent had negotiated with presidents, billionaires, and diplomats who filled every conversation with polished speeches about loyalty and integrity. Yet none of those carefully prepared words carried the quiet conviction contained in one simple sentence spoken by a maid who had expected nothing in return. For the first time that day, Vincent realized he was no longer testing Claire Bennett. Without either of them noticing when it happened, she had begun testing everyone else. When Vincent opened the conference room doors again, every conversation stopped immediately. The delegation returned to their seats, attorneys closed their tablets, and the translation team straightened their files with nervous precision. The atmosphere had changed completely. Confidence had been replaced by uncertainty, and everyone seemed to understand that the next few minutes would determine far more than the future of a business agreement. Claire quietly followed several steps behind Vincent, intending to return to the coffee cart where she believed she belonged. Before she reached it, Vincent spoke without turning around. Miss Bennett, take the empty seat beside the legal department. She froze. Several executives looked up in visible surprise. That chair had never been occupied by anyone outside the executive team. Claire hesitated. Sir, I don't think that's appropriate. Vincent looked directly at her. Neither was allowing inaccurate translations to reach my desk. No one argued. Slowly, Claire walked toward the chair and sat with careful posture, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She could feel dozens of eyes following every movement, yet she kept her attention on the documents placed before her. Vincent resumed his seat at the head of the table. We will begin again from page 1. The review lasted nearly an hour. Every multilingual clause was examined carefully. Whenever uncertainty appeared, Vincent looked toward Claire before anyone else. She never interrupted. She waited until she was asked, then explained each issue with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning. The Japanese chairman smiled several times as she clarified cultural expressions that traditional legal translations often ignored. The French advisor quietly admitted that one of her observations had prevented an expensive misunderstanding regarding insurance obligations. Even the Arabic investor complimented her respectful understanding of business etiquette embedded within the language itself. Little by little, skepticism disappeared from the room. Respect replaced it without anyone announcing that it had happened. Only one person remained visibly uncomfortable. The chief interpreter rarely spoke now, choosing instead to review his own notes while avoiding eye contact with everyone around the table. The attorneys who had dismissed Claire earlier also became unusually quiet, correcting their own annotations as though hoping no one would remember their confidence from that morning. Vincent remembered. He remembered everything. Once the final page had been approved, the Japanese chairman stood and extended his hand across the table. Mr. Moretti, today could have ended very differently. Your organization is fortunate to have someone who values accuracy more than recognition. Vincent accepted the handshake. I agree. The agreement was signed only after every language matched perfectly. Pens touched paper one final time, this time without hesitation. Soft applause filled the conference room as months of negotiation officially reached their conclusion. Relief spread across the faces of investors and advisors alike. Claire quietly gathered the unused documents, believing the extraordinary day had finally reached its end. She expected to return to polishing silver, preparing guest rooms, and disappearing once more into the rhythm of ordinary work. She had no idea that Vincent had already made another decision. As the international guests left the room offering polite thanks and respectful nods toward Claire, Vincent remained seated, watching members of his own executive staff congratulate one another for a successful negotiation. They had nearly compromised themselves. He observed the practiced smiles, the relieved laughter, the carefully chosen words of self-preservation. Then his gaze settled briefly on Claire as she collected empty coffee cups with the same humility she had shown before anyone knew her name. In that quiet moment, Vincent understood something that years of business experience had never fully taught him. Competence could be hired. Credentials could be purchased. Reputation could be manufactured. But integrity revealed itself only when someone chose truth over personal safety. And that kind of character could never be written on a resume. The last of the international guests departed beneath a line of black umbrellas as the rain finally began to soften into a light evening mist. Staff members quietly restored the conference room to its usual perfection, replacing crystal glasses, collecting folders, and polishing the long walnut table until no trace of the day's extraordinary meeting remained. Claire carried a tray toward the service entrance with the same careful pace she had followed every morning for the past 8 months. To her, the day had been unusual, but it was over. She expected tomorrow to look exactly like yesterday. Before she reached the hallway, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Alvarez, hurried toward her with visible concern. "Mr. Moretti wants every department head in the conference room immediately," she whispered. "Including you." Claire blinked in confusion. "Including me?" Mrs. Alvarez nodded slowly. "I've worked here 17 years. I've never heard him request that before." Within minutes, department supervisors, attorneys, translators, executive assistants, and senior managers had returned to the same room where the negotiations had taken place. The atmosphere felt noticeably different now. There were no foreign investors, no business partners, no contracts waiting to be signed. Only employees wondering why they had been summoned back after business hours. Claire quietly stood near the rear wall beside the housekeeping staff, hoping to remain unnoticed once again. Vincent entered precisely at 6 o'clock, carrying nothing except a slim black folder. He placed it on the table without opening it and surveyed the room with calm, unreadable eyes. "Today's meeting revealed 2 separate problems," he began. "One was a translation error. The second concerns me far more." No one moved. An organization does not fail because one person makes a mistake. Organizations fail when 7 qualified people approve the same mistake without questioning it. Several members of the legal department lowered their eyes. Vincent continued without raising his voice. "Even more concerning, when someone identified the error, your first reaction was not curiosity. It was embarrassment. Your priority became protecting titles instead of protecting the truth." The room grew perfectly still. Vincent opened the folder. "Effective immediately, the current translation department is dissolved." A quiet gasp spread through the room. The chief interpreter's shoulders stiffened. Vincent remained composed. "Every member of that division will receive severance packages consistent with company policy and professional references acknowledging previous years of service. This decision is based on organizational accountability, not personal hostility." He closed the folder again before looking toward the legal department. "The legal review committee is also being completely restructured. Until the review is complete, every multilingual contract will require independent verification before reaching my office." No one argued. They already understood the decision had been made long before they entered the room. Then Vincent looked toward the back of the conference room. "Miss Bennett." Claire felt every head turn toward her once again. She stepped forward cautiously. "Yes, sir." Vincent studied her quietly before speaking. "This morning you risked your position to protect people who had never shown you the same respect. You corrected experienced professionals without humiliating them. You answered every question without arrogance. Most importantly, you valued truth above comfort." Claire lowered her eyes. "I was only doing what I believed was right, sir." Vincent nodded once. "Exactly." Another silence settled over the room. "Beginning tomorrow morning, you will no longer report to housekeeping." Claire looked up in genuine surprise. Before she could speak, Vincent continued. "You will serve as Director of International Language Review and Special Communications, reporting directly to my office while completing any additional legal certification the company chooses to sponsor." The room seemed to stop breathing. Claire opened her mouth, searching for words that refused to come. Around her, people who had overlooked her for months now stared with stunned disbelief. Vincent offered no dramatic smile and no speech about second chances. He simply acknowledged what had become impossible to ignore. Ability had always been standing quietly in the room. It had merely been wearing the wrong uniform for everyone else to notice. No one spoke after Vincent's announcement. The silence carried a different weight now, no longer filled with uncertainty, but with recognition. Claire stood motionless, her hands still folded neatly in front of her, as though she were waiting for someone to explain that a mistake had been made. She had walked into the mansion 8 months earlier carrying a small suitcase, a recommendation letter, and a determination to earn an honest living without asking anyone to notice her. Never once had she imagined that the same conference room where she served coffee would become the place where her life quietly changed direction. Mrs. Alvarez was the first to step forward. The veteran housekeeper smiled with eyes that glistened with pride before gently squeezing Claire's hand. "I always knew you were different," she whispered. "I just never knew how different." Claire smiled softly. "You gave me work when I needed it most. I'll never forget that." Across the room, several employees who had barely acknowledged her existence earlier that morning now approached one by one. A young legal assistant apologized for laughing when she interrupted the meeting. Another manager admitted he had judged her before hearing a single word she said. Claire accepted every apology with the same grace she had shown throughout the day. She never reminded anyone they had been wrong. She simply thanked them and wished them well. Vincent watched quietly from the far end of the conference room. Leadership had taught him that policies could change organizations, but character changed people. What he witnessed now could never have been ordered or demanded. Respect had appeared naturally because truth had been stronger than pride. The following Monday morning, the mansion looked exactly as it always had. Marble floors reflected the sunrise. Staff members prepared breakfast. Security teams reviewed schedules. Couriers delivered contracts from around the world. Yet something subtle had changed. Claire no longer entered through the service corridor carrying a coffee tray. Instead, she walked through the front office carrying a portfolio filled with multilingual agreements waiting for review. The greeting she received from employees was no longer polite habit. It was genuine respect. Weeks passed, and the improvements reached far beyond one promotion. International negotiations became smoother. Misunderstandings disappeared before becoming expensive disputes. New training programs encouraged employees at every level to question unclear information rather than remain silent. Vincent introduced a simple principle that soon appeared in every department handbook. The strongest idea in the room deserved to be heard, regardless of the title attached to the person speaking. One afternoon, another important delegation visited the estate. As the guests entered the conference room, one executive quietly asked Vincent where he had found such an exceptional language specialist. Vincent glanced toward Claire, who was reviewing documents near the window with the same calm concentration she had always possessed. A faint smile crossed his face. "She was here all along," he replied. "The only difference is that now everyone sees her." The executive looked puzzled, but Vincent offered no further explanation. He understood that some lessons could never be taught through speeches. They had to be witnessed. As evening settled over Manhattan, golden light stretched across the polished floors where Claire had once walked hoping to remain invisible. She paused for a moment beside the same coffee cart she had pushed on her first day, gently resting her hand on its polished handle before continuing toward her new office. It reminded her that honest work was never something to be ashamed of, and that dignity did not begin when people recognized talent. It had always been there from the very beginning. On that quiet evening, inside a mansion built on influence and authority, everyone remembered something far more valuable than power. The greatest mistake is not overlooking talent because it is hidden. The greatest mistake is overlooking a person because of where they happen to stand. And on that day, the entire house remembered what dignity truly looks like.